The midday sun blazed mercilessly over downtown Riverside, California, turning the concrete plaza into a shimmering oven. Sarah wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, her other hand never pausing as she flipped another burger on the cramped grill inside her weathered food truck. The line snaked around the corner, office workers clutching $20 bills and checking their phones impatiently. The lunch rush was her lifeline, the difference between making rent on the tiny studio apartment she shared with 2 roommates and spending another night sleeping in the truck's passenger seat. Her truck, Sarah's Street Eats, bore the scars of 3 years on the road. Dents marked where shopping carts had collided during hurried relocations, and rust crept along the edges of the serving window. The yellow paint, once bright as sunshine, had faded to the color of old mustard. But it was hers, bought with every penny she had scraped together after aging out of foster care at 18. No one could take it away from her, not like everything else that had been ripped from her life. The city hummed with the familiar rhythm of American ambition. Construction workers grabbed quick meals between shifts, young professionals balanced salads while walking back to glass office towers. And mothers pushed strollers while juggling coffee cups and toddlers. Everyone chasing something, everyone running from something else. Sarah understood that hustle in her bones. She had been running since she was 15, when the last foster family decided she was too much trouble, and the system decided she was too old to care. At the back of the line, a man in a faded blue work shirt shifted a small girl from one hip to the other. David Martinez had gotten off his construction shift early to pick up lunch for himself and his daughter. His work boots were caked with dried concrete, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who built things for a living. 4-year-old Emma nestled against his shoulder, her curly brown hair escaping from a lopsided ponytail that he had attempted that morning. Single fatherhood was a learning curve he was still navigating, 18 months after his ex-wife had decided that motherhood was not the adventure she had signed up for. Sarah's movements were efficient, almost mechanical. Order, cook, package, money, change, next. She had perfected the art of friendly professionalism, the kind that kept customers coming back without inviting personal conversation. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and despite the heat, she wore a long-sleeved shirt to cover the scar that ran from her elbow to her wrist. A reminder of the car accident that had claimed her parents when she was 12. The lunch crowd was typical for a Tuesday. Teachers from the nearby elementary school pooled their change for shared orders. Construction workers from the new shopping center development grabbed quick protein, and office workers from the bank across the street made their usual requests. Sarah knew most of their orders by heart, but she never let familiarity soften her professional distance. Relationships were luxury items she could not afford. As the line slowly moved forward, David found himself studying the woman behind the counter. Something about her profile nagged at him, a half-remembered melody that refused to resolve. Emma was growing heavy in his arms, but he did not want to put her down in the crowded plaza. She was still small for her age, and crowds made her nervous. The divorce had been hard on her, though she was too young to understand why mommy lived in a different state now, and only called on birthdays. The sun beat down without mercy, reflecting off car windshields and making the asphalt soft underfoot. A businessman in a rumpled suit loosened his tie as he waited. And an elderly woman fanned herself with a folded newspaper. Sarah worked with the determination of someone who knew that stopping meant sinking. Every hamburger, every order of fries, every cold drink was a small victory against the weight of bills and debt, and the constant fear of falling further behind. David remembered the feeling well. When Emma was born, he had thought he had it all figured out. A steady job, a wife, a plan for the future. But life had a way of reshuffling the deck when you least expected it. Now he worked overtime whenever possible, saved every spare dollar, and tried to be both mother and father to a little girl who deserved better than the uncertain future he could offer. The line crept forward with painful slowness. Office workers checked their watches and calculated whether they would make it back before their lunch breaks expired. Sarah maintained her pace, knowing that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to complaints, and complaints led to lost customers. She had learned to read people quickly, to gauge their patience, and adjust her service accordingly. The businessman needed efficiency, the elderly woman wanted acknowledgement, the teachers required value for their limited budgets. As David moved closer to the front of the line, the woman behind the counter came into clearer view. Her face was thinner than he remembered, marked by years of struggle and self-reliance. But the green eyes were the same, still sharp and guarded. His heart began to race as recognition dawned, memories flooding back from a time when life had seemed full of possibility rather than compromise. Sarah glanced up from the grill to gauge the remaining line, her eyes sweeping over the waiting customers with practiced assessment. Her gaze passed over the man holding the small girl, but something made her look again. She felt a chill, despite the oppressive heat, a familiar tightness in her chest that she had not experienced in years. She forced herself to look away, to focus on the order she was preparing, but her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped the sandwich. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Room 217 at Jefferson High School, where she had sat in the back corner, trying to be invisible in clothes that never quite fit right. The boy who had quietly placed his lunch money on her desk, when he thought no one was looking. The same boy who had walked her to the bus stop, when Derek Morrison and his friends were waiting to humiliate her for being the girl whose parents had died, the girl who lived with strangers, the girl who smelled like thrift store clothes and desperation. David's throat felt dry as he approached the serving window. Emma was asking for juice, her small voice cutting through the noise of the plaza, but he barely heard her. 15 years had passed since he had last seen Sarah Coleman, 15 years since she had disappeared from school without explanation, leaving behind only rumors and questions that no one seemed able to answer. Sarah's professional smile felt frozen on her face as she served the customer ahead of David. Her movements became more rigid, more careful, as if she were walking on ice that might crack at any moment. She could feel his presence like a weight on her shoulders, could sense his eyes on her face. The safe distance she had built between herself and the world was suddenly, terrifyingly thin. When David finally reached the front of the line, he set Emma down gently, keeping one hand on her shoulder. The little girl looked up at Sarah with wide, curious eyes, unaware of the tension crackling between the adults above her. Sarah forced herself to make eye contact, her customer service mask firmly in place. David leaned slightly forward, his voice barely above a whisper, meant only for her ears. "Still remember me?" The words hit Sarah like a lightning strike, shattering the careful composure she had built over years of survival. Her hand tightened on the spatula she was holding, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining control. The plaza around them seemed to fade away, the noise of traffic and conversation becoming a distant hum. Time collapsed, bringing the past rushing into the present with devastating clarity. She remembered everything. The way he had defended her when Derek Morrison called her charity case in front of the entire cafeteria. The homework he had helped her with in the library, never making her feel stupid for not understanding concepts that came easily to him. The gentle way he had picked up her scattered books when someone accidentally knocked them from her hands. The last conversation they had shared, when she had promised to see him the next day, knowing she would be gone before sunrise. Emma tugged on Sarah's apron, her voice sweet and innocent. "Miss, do you have juice boxes?" Sarah looked down at the little girl, seeing David's eyes in a smaller, softer face. Her heart clenched with a mixture of longing and terror. This was his daughter, this beautiful child who looked at the world with trust and wonder. Sarah had forgotten what it felt like to see through eyes unclouded by disappointment and betrayal. "Of course, sweetheart," Sarah managed, her voice rougher than she intended. She retrieved a juice box from the small refrigerator, her hands shaking slightly as she handed it down. Emma beamed up at her, and Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, a wall she had built to protect herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. David watched the exchange with careful attention, noting the way Sarah's entire demeanor changed when she looked at his daughter. The hard edges softened, the professional distance wavered. For a moment, he caught a glimpse of the girl he had known in high school, the one who had fed stray cats behind the gymnasium, and had once cried quietly in the library while reading To Kill a Mockingbird. "What can I get you?" Sarah asked, her voice deliberately neutral, but David could see the storm in her green eyes. "2 cheeseburgers and fries," he replied, matching her professional tone. "And maybe a conversation." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you think you remember, but you've got the wrong person." Emma looked between them with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possess. Sensing undercurrents she could not understand, she sipped her juice box and watched her father's face, recognizing the same expression he wore when he looked at old photographs. David pulled out his wallet, counting out exact change. "My mistake," he said quietly. "Have a good day, Sarah." The sound of her name on his lips was almost her undoing. Sarah turned away abruptly, focusing on the grill with desperate intensity. She could feel other customers in line growing impatient, could hear the irritated murmurs and checking of phones. She needed to move, needed to keep working, needed to maintain the rhythm that kept her world stable. But as David walked away with Emma, something inside Sarah screamed in protest. She watched them settle at a picnic table in the shade of a oak tree, Emma chattering animatedly while David unwrapped their lunch. The sight of them together, father and daughter, in their own small world, made Sarah's chest ache with a longing she had thought she had successfully buried. The next customer stepped forward. A regular who ordered the same turkey sandwich every Tuesday. Sarah served him with automatic efficiency, but her attention kept drifting to the table under the tree. Emma was trying to share her juice box with her father, and David was laughing at something she had said. The sound of his laughter carried across the plaza, and Sarah remembered the boy who had found joy in small moments even when his own family was struggling to make ends meet. Sarah had known David's story, even when they were teenagers. His father had been laid off from the automotive plant, and his mother worked double shifts at the hospital to keep their family afloat. But David had never let financial stress dim his natural optimism, never let his own problems prevent him from noticing when others were hurting. He had been the kind of person who made the world a little bit better just by existing in it. After her parents died, Sarah had been placed with the Hendersons, a family who took in foster children for the monthly stipend rather than any desire to help. She had learned to be grateful for a roof over her head and enough food to survive, even when Mrs. Henderson made it clear that Sarah was an unwanted burden. School had been her escape, and David had been her anchor, though she had never told him how much his quiet kindness had meant to her. The lunch rush began to wind down, but Sarah's thoughts remained tangled in memories she had spent years trying to forget. She remembered the night she had overheard Mrs. Henderson on the phone, complaining about the difficult foster girl who was costing them more than she was worth. She remembered packing her few belongings into a backpack and slipping out before dawn, choosing the unknown dangers of the streets over the certain rejection of another failed placement. She had been 15 years old, and completely alone in the world, armed with nothing but determination and the desperate need to prove that she could survive without depending on anyone else. The years that followed had been a blur of minimum wage jobs, night school, and the constant struggle to stay one step ahead of homelessness. She had built her current life through sheer force of will, and she was not about to let nostalgia undermine everything she had worked for. David and Emma finished their lunch as the afternoon heat reached its peak. Other customers had come and gone, but they remained at their table, Emma drawing pictures on napkins while David checked messages on his phone. Sarah tried to ignore them, but she found herself stealing glances when she thought no one was looking. As the day wore on, Sarah convinced herself that the encounter had been an unfortunate coincidence, nothing more. David would finish his lunch, take his daughter home, and disappear back into whatever life he had built for himself. She would continue running her business, paying her bills, and maintaining the safe distance she had established between herself and emotional entanglements. But as closing time approached and she began the familiar routine of cleaning and securing the truck, Sarah looked up to find David standing at the serving window again, this time without Emma. "She's at daycare," he explained, as if reading her unspoken question. "I have a few minutes before I need to pick her up." Sarah continued wiping down the counter, not trusting herself to look at him directly. "We're closed." "I'm not here for food," David said quietly. "I'm here because 15 years ago, the bravest girl I knew disappeared without a trace, and I never stopped wondering what happened to her." Sarah's hand stilled on the counter. The plaza was nearly empty now, the lunch crowd long gone, the afternoon shoppers not yet arrived. In the sudden quiet, his words seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. "That girl doesn't exist anymore," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not," David replied. But Sarah Coleman was the girl who stood up to Derek Morrison when he was bullying that kid with the speech impediment. Sarah Coleman was the girl who found Mrs. Patterson's lost cat and spent her own lunch money to buy it food. Sarah Coleman was the girl who tutored struggling students, even though she was struggling herself. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. She had not cried in years, had trained herself to convert sadness into anger, vulnerability into strength. "You don't know anything about who I am now." "You're right," David admitted. "But I know who you were, and I can see glimpses of her in the woman who just spent 10 minutes patiently explaining the menu to that elderly gentleman, and who slipped an extra cookie into that little boy's bag when his mother wasn't looking." Sarah turned away, ostensibly to organize supplies that were already perfectly arranged. "People change, life changes them. Some changes are for the better," David said. "You built this, Sarah. You created something from nothing. That takes courage." "It takes desperation," Sarah corrected bitterly. "There's a difference." David was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "What happened to you after you left? Where did you go?" Sarah's shoulders tensed. She had never told anyone the complete story, had learned that vulnerability was a luxury that people like her could not afford. "I survived. That's all that matters." "It's not all that matters," David said firmly. "You matter. You always mattered." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 15 years of unspoken questions and regrets. Sarah felt the familiar urge to run, to pack up her truck and find a new city, a new start, a place where the past could not find her. She had done it before, would do it again if necessary. "I have to go," she said abruptly, moving toward the truck's cab. "I have things to do." David stepped back, giving her space but not giving up. I'll be back tomorrow. Same time. Sarah paused with her hand on the door handle. Why? Because 15 years ago, I let the most important person in my life disappear without fighting for her, David said. I'm not making that mistake again. Sarah climbed into the truck without responding, but as she drove away, she could see David in her rearview mirror, standing alone in the plaza, watching her go. The image stayed with her as she navigated the evening traffic, as she parked the truck in the commissary lot, as she walked to the bus stop that would take her to her tiny shared apartment. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, Emma's innocent smile, and David's steady gaze haunting her thoughts. She had worked so hard to build a life where the past could not touch her, where she was beholden to no one and dependent on nothing but her own strength. The appearance of David and his daughter threatened to unravel everything she had built, to expose the loneliness she had convinced herself was freedom. The next day dawned gray and humid, the kind of weather that made clothes stick to skin and tempers run short. Sarah arrived at her usual spot in the plaza early, going through her opening routine with mechanical precision. She told herself that David would not return, that yesterday had been an impulse that would fade in the harsh light of responsibility and routine. But as the lunch crowd began to gather, she spotted him in line again, Emma perched on his shoulders this time, giggling as he swayed gently from side to side. Sarah's heart clenched at the sight of them, at the easy affection between father and daughter that spoke of a love that was unconditional and secure. When they reached the front of the line, Emma waved enthusiastically. "Hi, Miss Sarah. Daddy said you make the best hamburgers in the whole city." Sarah felt a flush of unexpected pleasure at the compliment, even as she maintained her professional composure. Did he now? David's eyes met hers over his daughter's head. Among other things, Sarah busied herself preparing their order, hyper-aware of Emma's chattering commentary about her daycare activities and David's quiet presence. When she handed down Emma's juice box, the little girl surprised her by reaching out to touch Sarah's hand. "You have pretty eyes," Emma said solemnly. "They're green like the leaves on Daddy's plants." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had forgotten how children could see straight through adult pretenses to the heart of things. "Thank you, sweetheart." As they prepared to leave, Emma turned back to the window. "Miss Sarah, do you have a little girl?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Well, you can share mine if you want," Emma said with the generous logic of a 4-year-old. "Daddy says, sharing makes everything better." Sarah watched them walk away, Emma skipping beside her father, chattering about something that made him laugh. The sound of that laughter followed Sarah through the rest of the lunch rush, through the afternoon lull, through the cleanup routine that ended her day. Over the following weeks, David and Emma became regular customers, appearing in line like clockwork every Tuesday and Thursday. Sarah found herself looking forward to their visits despite her better judgment, anticipating Emma's innocent questions and David's steady presence. The little girl had a way of drawing stories out of people, and Sarah discovered herself sharing small details about her work, her truck, her daily routine. One particularly busy Thursday, the lunch rush was more chaotic than usual. A catering order had fallen through at the last minute, leaving Sarah scrambling to serve an unexpected surge of customers. She was falling behind, the line was growing restless, and her equipment was acting up in the heat. When David and Emma reached the front of the line, Sarah was flustered and sweaty, her professional composure cracking under the pressure. Emma immediately noticed her distress. "Miss Sarah, are you okay?" the little girl asked with concern. "Just busy, sweetheart," Sarah managed, trying to smile despite her stress. Without being asked, David stepped around to the service window. "What can I do to help?" Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain her independence, but the genuine offer of assistance from someone who expected nothing in return touched something deep inside her. "The napkin dispensers need refilling," she admitted. David quickly organized the napkins while Emma helped by sorting plastic utensils with the serious concentration of someone entrusted with an important task. Their assistance allowed Sarah to catch up with the orders, and by the time the rush subsided, she was back in control. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly when the last customer had been served. "Anytime," David replied, and Sarah could see that he meant it. As summer progressed into fall, the dynamic between them began to shift in subtle ways. Emma started bringing drawings she had made at daycare, proudly displaying them on the small bulletin board inside Sarah's truck. David began arriving a few minutes early, helping Sarah set up tables and chairs when the weather was nice enough for outdoor seating. Sarah found herself sharing more personal details, small stories about her daily life, that she had never told anyone. She learned that David worked for a construction company that specialized in affordable housing, that he coached Emma's Little League team on weekends, that he was taking night classes in project management to improve his career prospects. The more time she spent with them, the more Sarah began to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself. Emma's innocent affection, and David's steady friendship, began to chip away at the walls she had built around her heart. One evening in late September, as Sarah was closing up the truck, she noticed David sitting alone at one of the picnic tables, looking troubled. Emma was at her grandmother's house for the night, and David seemed lost without his usual companion. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, approaching his table with uncharacteristic boldness. David looked up, his expression weary. "Just thinking about the future, about what kind of life I'm giving Emma. Sometimes, I wonder if she'd be better off with her mother, with more stability, more opportunities." Sarah sat down across from him, recognizing the self-doubt that she had battled her entire life. "That little girl adores you, anyone can see that. Adoration doesn't pay for college or provide health insurance," David said bitterly. "It doesn't make up for the fact that I'm 28 years old and still living paycheck to paycheck. Money isn't everything," Sarah said, then immediately felt hypocritical for offering advice she had never been able to follow herself. David studied her face in the fading light. "Says the woman who works 16-hour days to keep her business afloat." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "When I was Emma's age, I would have given anything to have a parent who cared about me the way you care about her. Money comes and goes, but that kind of love? That stays with a person forever." It was the most personal thing she had ever shared with him, and David seemed to understand the significance of her trust. They sat in comfortable silence as the plaza emptied around them, two people who had learned to carry their burdens alone, discovering that sharing the weight made it more bearable. October brought the first cold snap of the season, and with it, a crisis that would test everything Sarah had built. A city health inspector, apparently prompted by a complaint from a competing food vendor, arrived unannounced and conducted the most thorough examination Sarah's truck had ever endured. The inspector was a thin, officious man who seemed to take pleasure in finding fault. He cited Sarah for minor violations that other inspectors had overlooked, demanded immediate corrections that would require significant expense, and threatened to shut down her operation if she could not comply within 48 hours. Sarah sat in her truck after the inspector left, staring at the violation notice with growing panic. The required repairs would cost more money than she had, and losing even 2 days of income would put her behind on rent. For the first time in years, she felt the familiar terror of complete helplessness, the same feeling she had experienced as a 15-year-old, with nowhere to go. She was so absorbed in her despair that she did not notice David approaching until he knocked gently on the service window. "Sarah? Emma wanted to know if you're okay. She said you look sad." Sarah looked up to find Emma peering at her with worried eyes, her small face pressed against the glass. The sight of the little girl's concern broke something loose in Sarah's chest. "I might have to close the truck for a few days," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Some repairs need to be made." David frowned. "What kind of repairs?" Despite her instinct to handle problems alone, Sarah found herself explaining the situation. David listened without judgment, his expression growing more serious as she detailed the violations and the costs involved. "How much?" he asked when she finished. "More than I have," Sarah admitted. David was quiet for a moment, then pulled out his phone. "I know some people who do restaurant equipment repair. Let me make some calls." "David, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," he interrupted gently. "I'm offering." Within 2 hours, David had arranged for a friend who worked in restaurant maintenance to examine Sarah's equipment. The man, a soft-spoken immigrant named Carlos, quickly identified solutions that would satisfy the inspector's requirements at a fraction of the cost Sarah had been quoted. "The burner just needs a new gas line," Carlos explained. "And this ventilation issue, that's a $20 part. These other guys, they wanted to sell you a whole new system." As Carlos worked, David and Emma stayed to keep Sarah company. Emma entertained herself by organizing Sarah's supplies and creating elaborate stories about the adventures of various kitchen utensils. Her innocent chatter filled the truck with warmth that had nothing to do with the cooking equipment. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked David quietly, while Emma was distracted with her games. David considered the question seriously. "Because 15 years ago, you showed me that kindness matters, even when life is hard. Especially when life is hard." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but this time she did not fight them. "I disappeared without saying goodbye. I hurt you. You were 15 and scared," David said simply. "You did what you had to do to survive. I could have found a way to contact you later, when I was older. I chose not to." "Why?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching Emma arrange plastic spoons into complicated patterns. "Because I was ashamed. Because I thought you deserved better than someone who came from nothing and had nothing to offer." David's expression softened. Sarah, you never came from nothing. You came from loss, which is different. And you've built something amazing from that loss. Look around you. You created this business, this life, through your own determination. How is that nothing? The repairs were completed by the end of the day, and the reinspection the following morning went smoothly. Sarah reopened her truck with a mixture of relief and gratitude that left her feeling emotionally raw. When David and Emma appeared for lunch, she had to turn away to compose herself. "Miss Sarah," Emma said, tugging on her apron. "Daddy brought you something." David handed her a small potted plant, a hardy succulent with thick, green leaves. Emma picked it out. "She said it looked strong like you." Sarah accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly. She could not remember the last time someone had given her something simply because they wanted to, without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," she whispered, and David understood that she was thanking him for much more than the plant. As November arrived, bringing crisp autumn air and earlier sunsets, Sarah found her routine expanding to include David and Emma in ways she had not planned. Emma had appointed herself as Sarah's unofficial assistant, helping to organize supplies and greet customers with enthusiastic recommendations. David had become a reliable source of practical support, fixing minor equipment problems, and helping with the heavy lifting that came with daily setup and breakdown. Sarah began to allow herself to imagine what it might be like to have a real family, people who cared about her welfare without expecting anything in return. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, representing everything she had convinced herself she did not need. One particularly quiet Tuesday, with Emma at preschool and most of the lunch crowd served, David lingered at the counter longer than usual. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his expression serious. Sarah's heart clenched with familiar anxiety. People always had something to tell her when they were about to leave, about to move on to better opportunities, about to remember that she was not worth the effort. "The construction company is opening a new division in Portland," David continued. "They offered me a supervisor position. Better pay, better benefits, better future for Emma." Sarah nodded, forcing herself to smile. "That's wonderful. You should take it." "I told them I needed time to think about it." "Why?" The word escaped before Sarah could stop it. David leaned against the counter, his eyes never leaving her face. "Because leaving would mean starting over somewhere new, and I found something here I don't want to lose." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "David, I know you're scared," he said quietly. "I know you've learned to protect yourself by not depending on anyone else. But Emma and we're not going anywhere unless you want us to." Sarah felt the walls she had built around her heart trembling, threatening to collapse entirely. "I don't know how to be what you need." "You don't have to be anything other than who you are," David said. "You don't have to be perfect or have all the answers. You just have to be willing to try." The conversation was interrupted by a group of customers, but David's words stayed with Sarah for the rest of the day. That evening, as she cleaned her equipment and prepared to close, she found herself standing in front of the small mirror inside her truck, looking at her reflection with new eyes. She saw a woman who had survived when survival seemed impossible, who had built something meaningful from nothing, who had learned to find strength in solitude. But she also saw someone who had been hiding from the very thing she had always wanted most: a place to belong. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the plaza to find Emma waiting with a construction paper card decorated with crayon flowers and glitter stars. "I made this for you," Emma announced proudly. "Daddy helped me write the words." Sarah opened the card to find a child's careful printing. "Dear Miss Sarah, will you be my extra mommy? Love, Emma." Sarah sank to her knees, bringing herself to Emma's eye level. The little girl's face was bright with hope and innocence, completely trusting that the adults in her life would make decisions that would keep her safe and happy. "Sweetheart," Sarah said carefully, "what did your daddy tell you about this card?" "He said that sometimes grown-ups need to take their time to make important decisions," Emma replied seriously. "But I already decided. I want you to stay." Sarah looked up to find David approaching, his expression cautious but hopeful. He had clearly coached Emma on what to say, but the sentiment was entirely the little girl's own. "She's been working on that card for 3 days," David said softly. "I told her you might need time to think about it." Sarah stood slowly, the card clutched in her hands. Around them, the plaza was coming to life with the morning crowd, people hurrying to work with coffee cups and briefcases, absorbed in their own concerns. But in this small bubble of possibility, time seemed suspended. "I don't know how to be a mother," Sarah said finally. "I didn't know how to be a father," David replied. "But Emma taught me. Kids have a way of showing you what love looks like when you let them." Sarah looked down at Emma, who was watching the exchange with the patient confidence of a child who had never doubted that she was loved. "And if I'm not good at it? Then you'll learn," David said simply. We all will. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening that she had kept locked for 15 years. The terror was still there, the voice that warned her not to trust, not to hope, not to risk the pain of loss. But stronger than the fear was the recognition of what was being offered, not just love, but the chance to give love in return. "Okay," she whispered, and Emma let out a squeal of delight that made half the plaza turn to look. The little girl launched herself into Sarah's arms, and Sarah caught her instinctively, holding her close while David's arms encircled them both. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah allowed herself to be part of something larger than her own survival. The months that followed brought changes that Sarah had never imagined possible. David turned down the job in Portland, choosing instead to pursue the project management certification that would allow him to advance within his current company. Sarah found herself gradually expanding her operation, hiring part-time help that allowed her to spend more time with Emma. The little girl divided her after-school hours between her grandmother's house and the food truck, becoming a fixture in the plaza that customers came to expect. She helped Sarah with simple tasks, chattering constantly about her day, her dreams, her plans for the future that now included Sarah as a permanent fixture. David and Sarah navigated the transition from friends to something more with the careful attention of two people who understood that they were building something precious and fragile. They took their time, learning each other's rhythms and routines, discovering how their separate lives could merge into something stronger together. On a warm evening in late spring, as Sarah closed the truck and prepared to join David and Emma for dinner at their apartment, she paused to look around the plaza that had become the center of her world. The same business people hurried past with their phones and briefcases. The same construction workers grabbed quick meals between shifts. The same elderly couples fed pigeons from park benches. But now Sarah saw the scene differently. She was no longer an observer on the margins of other people's lives. No longer protecting herself from connection and community. She was part of the fabric of this place, woven into the daily routines of customers who had become friends, who asked about her weekend plans, and remembered her birthday. Emma ran up to her, grabbing her hand with the casual affection that had become second nature. "Come on, Miss Sarah. Daddy's making spaghetti, and I'm helping." Sarah allowed herself to be pulled toward the future, toward the family she had never dared to hope for, toward the life she was finally brave enough to claim. Behind them, the food truck sat quietly in the fading light. A testament to survival transformed into something much more precious. A foundation for love. As they walked through the plaza together, David carrying their dinner supplies, and Emma chattering about her plans for the evening, Sarah understood that sometimes the most important journeys were not about moving forward, but about allowing the past to catch up, about letting old wounds heal, about finding the courage to believe that she was worthy of the love that had been waiting for her all along. The city hummed around them with its familiar rhythm of ambition and hope, but now Sarah was part of that rhythm rather than fighting against it. She had learned that strength was not just about survival, but about having the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of what came before. In the distance, the lights of downtown began to twinkle against the darkening sky, and Sarah Coleman finally understood that she was home.